All right, we're all good?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us here at the Stimson Center and online. Welcome to the Stimson Center, and for those who have also turned into the live stream, this is an event hosted by the South Asia Program and the Asia Strategy Initiative, which is a joint effort by Stimson's Asia programs to feature regional perspectives on shifting strategic dynamics in the Indo-Pacific and Asia writ large. I'm your host today, Samir Lalwani. I direct our South Asia program, and this event is India and Nuclear Asia, Forces, Doctrine, and Danger. It's fitting to start off 2019 on this foot with the first event of the Stimson's year to be on the 30th anniversary of the Stimson Center, that we're starting off discussing Asia, and particularly strategic dynamics in Asia. Not only because it's a hot topic these days in Washington, D.C., but it's been a central point of our research and conversation and focus at the Stimson Center for 30 years. So really glad that Frank and Yogesh could join us here today. Their book that we're all featuring, India and Nuclear Asia, which you should all take a look at and get a copy of later, is basically about India's nuclear profile, doctrine, practices that have evolved rapidly since the country's nuclear breakout since 1998. But the authors contend that multiple Asian powers have been, I would actually argue that multiple Asian powers have been undergoing rapid changes in the environment, ambition, military capability, and strategy. And so I'm really interested to sort of hear what Yogesh and Frank have to say about that. They're going to sort of recount a little bit about their findings from their book, and then we'll have two other distinguished speakers to offer a commentary and their take on sort of the evolving trajectories within Asia. I wanted to take a moment, though, to reflect a little bit upon a phrase that the authors use, which is sort of the evolution of doctrine and forces. But oftentimes I think we use another term these days around town and the literature on modernization. So evolution sort of sometimes is equated with modernization. And as I was reading their book in the last few days, and particularly this morning, I was puzzling on this, like what exactly is forced modernization? Because it's something that all states engage in. It sounds fairly benign and maybe even appealing, but it means a lot of different things to a lot of different actors. Do we basically mean arms racing, trying to gain an advantage over adversaries? Do we mean arms pacing, trying to close a gap with other peers? Or arms replacing, trying to stay in place, essentially, through replacement of existing capabilities that are deteriorating or have deteriorated. And I think this is a question that you can ask about India and its forced modernization project, but also a number of other countries in Asia and the United States as well. There's some other question that that were teased out in reading this book. Does the pace of modernization and sort of the components of modernization start to overwhelm intention? So even if you have benign motives or motives to sort of enhance stability and deterrence, does that matter if it's perceived in very different terms? And that seems to dovetail with another question: is are these the effects of modernization stabilizing or destabilizing? I think the authors start to really push this question really well in asking questions not only about deliberate escalation, but also inadvertent escalation scenarios and how those could be perceived and what that means for crisis stability. Particularly as I think the authors do a really good job of drawing out the role of conventional counterforce. And I think the discussion in Washington seems to have missed that, the military technical revolution has hit a lot of countries around the world. And we've thought a lot about conventional counterforce in terms of what we can do to adversaries, but we haven't really thought about how those parties interact with each other. And so as advanced conventional capabilities develop, what they can use those for actually has strategic implications, not just day-to-day, conventional deterrence implications. Another question I think is drawn out in the book, and I'm sure we'll get into this afternoon, is a question of efficacy. Because does it really matter if you're modernizing your forces if you don't have the right national security software? And by this, I think some of the scholars here have done a lot of work on questions of national security decision-making processes, civil-military relations, intra-military jointness. All those questions seem to either be force multipliers or force limitations, regardless of the pace of modernization. And the last thing I was thinking about while I was reading this book is how do I square these discussions? Because these seem to happen, these discussions on strategy in Asia seem to happen apart from, I think, what has become a really popular discourse in Washington on the Indo-Pacific, on influence operations, on predatory economics. How do these two sort of discourses interact? And one question is, do these strategic forces, are they still relevant in employing political influence and geopolitical influence in a non-kinetic sort of set of engagements? Because it seems today a lot of discussion with respect to China and even in Russia, it's about information warfare, hybrid warfare, but theoretically avoiding a lot of sort of kinetic engagements. And are these tools that we're talking about that states are modernizing, are they really going to be useful for the kinds of future engagements that they're either being drawn into or preparing for? So I don't think the book provides all the answers to this, but it certainly provides some. And it helps us, I think, refine our understanding and the types of questions we need to be asking. And so I want to introduce all the speakers here and then turn it over to the panelists to sort of offer discussions and comments. So I'll start off from your left to right. Dr. Frank O'Donnell is a postdoctoral fellow at the in National Security Affairs Department at the Naval War College. He was previously an associate and Stanton Junior faculty fellow at the Belfer Center, and is also a non-resident fellow here with the Stimson Center. To his right is Dr. Yogesh Joshi, the second author of this book. We're here to FET today. He's a MacArthur Nuclear Security Postdoctoral Fellow at CSAC at Stanford University. And he was previously an associate fellow in the Strategic Studies program at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi, received his PhD from JNU, specializing in Indian foreign policy and security policy. To his right, we are joined by Lieutenant General Balraj Singh Nagal, who is former Commander-in-Chief of Indian Strategic Forces Command. He was recently director of the Center for Land Warfare Studies in New Delhi, and he's a former Chief of Strategic Program Staff and a Director General of Operational Logistics for the Indian Army, and a veteran of the 71 War and counterinsurgency operations in the Northeast. And finally, to his right is Dr. Caroline Milne, who's currently a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analyses, where she focuses on nuclear weapons policy and strategy for the Department of Defense. In 2017, she earned her PhD from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University and has previously worked at the RAND Corporation when we first were colleagues across the hall, and specializes in U.S. and Chinese perceptions of mutual nuclear stability and vulnerability. So why don't we start this off with the book authors talking a little bit about some of the key findings of the book, and then we'll move on to some discussants. I'll just ask quickly, as a matter of general housekeeping, to turn off your cell phones, and we'll, after some opening remarks, we'll turn it over to some question and answer. So with that, Frank, please take it away.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'll lead off. Just to start off by saying thank you to the audience for coming along today, including those of you tuning in via the live stream, for the Stimson Center and Samir for putting together this excellent panel, for the panelists for taking the time to be here and contribute to this book and its launch, and also to Georgetown University Press for being such a great press to work with from the initiation of this project through to being here today. So this book, as indicated by the title, has two principal roles. The first is to provide a comprehensive update of India's nuclear outlook, which spanned its nuclear force developments, conventional force developments salient to nuclear policy, related doctrinal debates and developments, and also its nuclear nonproliferation policies. And the second role is to situate these developments in India's wider regional strategic context, especially within the trilateral strategic complex of India, Pakistan, and China. We think this book is the most comprehensive update of these three different states and those developments in a single volume. And so, are there similar debates and developments going on within Pakistan and China as there are in India? How might those interact with the debates going on in India? And most pertinently for us, were there any trends that can be drawn across these three states that can be brought to the attention of scholars and policymakers alike? And so we argue that in all three states, the nuclear and nuclear-relevant doctrinal and force developments and their surrounding debates are elevating the dangers of inadvertent and accidental escalation within this trilateral complex. In terms of definitions, we define inadvertent escalation as a conventional attack upon nuclear forces or supportive systems, which bears the risk of introducing nuclear implications to previously conventional conflict. And accidental escalation is defined as a military action that was ordered by policymakers, but that still has unanticipated escalatory effects. There is an important distinction here in that compared to inadvertent escalation, accidental escalation accords greater comparative weight to the perceptions of the political leadership, the decision makers, and the surrounding security community, rather those of operational military forces under inadvertent escalation. And so looking at inverse escalation as a general trend, we find that there are three principal factors across the three states that are elevating inadvertent escalation risk. The first is the looming extension of the India-China-Pakistan trilateral complex and the nuclear competition to the naval domain. India and China are both fielding a new generation of nuclear-armed submarines and will necessarily learn about their operation partly through trial and error. Pakistan is also seeking its own naval and nuclear forces. Within this context, all three deploy strident maritime practices and doctrines. India has long viewed itself as a primary leader in the Indian Ocean. Pakistan has a tradition of using high-risk maneuvers and brinkmanship at sea to force adversaries to back down and is investing heavily in anti-access area denial capabilities, while China conducts regular submarine forays around Indian coastlines. The actual naval nuclear intentions, patrol routes, general maritime territories to be defended by all three states remain unclear. And there's little regional dialogue around these issues. Never mind how to manage, for example, a specific scenario in which a conventional boat comes into hostile contact with a nuclear armed vessel of another state. How do both states manage this kind of situation? The second inadvertent escalation factor is the growing prominence of dual-use delivery vehicles in all three states. At sea, nuclear weapons can be carried aboard surface ships and submarines. On land, it remains unclear with regard to India whether Indian conventional missiles such as the Prahar, Nirbhay, or BrahMos missiles will be solely conventional or dual-use. China also emphasizes dual-use missiles such as the DF-21 in its offensive strike planning. And with regard to Pakistan, the missions of the Pakistani Nasser tactical nuclear weapon and the Babur cruise missile, it's still unclear whether or not these will be solely nuclear or conventional. They remain undetermined. The third inadvertent escalation factor is the intentions of all three states to conduct early and consequential strikes upon adversary territory and quickly force conflict termination on their own terms. China military thinking prioritizes conventional missile barrages at an early stage in the conflict. Indian conventional force commanders will reportedly seek to destroy any adversary missile launchers within range, regardless whether or not these have a nuclear or a conventional mission. And also, in a lot of the current Indian doctrinal conversations and posturing developments, they're also starting to build the kind of capabilities for a similar early Chinese-like conventional missile barrage. Pakistan's tactical nuclear missile forces also threaten to significantly alter and escalate a regional conflict. And the understanding by all three states of these adversary plans and their potential responses and how they might view these kinds of operations in terms of their escalatory significance appears to be fairly unclear. They don't seem to be fully certain about how the adversary will read and respond to these sorts of operations. Moving now to accidental escalation, we find that there are two principal drivers of accidental escalation risk across these three states, which actually amplify the drivers which we've talked about previously. The first factor is the near absence of regional strategic dialogue. To give an example of the kinds of misperceptions that can flow from this absence of dialogue, Pakistan doubts India's claimed no first use policy. India doubts China's no first use policy in conditions that involve India. China refuses to officially recognize India as a nuclear weapons state. India refuses to believe that Pakistan will use the tactical nuclear missiles early in the conventional attack. And so as part of this absence of dialogue and the improved understanding of mutual thresholds, doctrines, force constitution, development plans, and perceptions does amplify the dangers of each of the developments I just mentioned above. The second accidental escalation factor are just the trends in nuclear posturing and debates across all three states. India's doctrine of no first use and massive retaliation, and its posture of credible minimum deterrence, is coming under ever greater public contestation within India. There are growing voices calling for an end to no first use and the massive retaliation commitment, and toward developing a larger and more technically diverse nuclear force. The public 2003 Indian nuclear doctrine has still not been updated, but the direction of this debate and the tenor of the new platforms being developed do suggest a certain level of Indian interest in counterforce warfighting capabilities. The Indian Defense Scientific Agency, DRDO, has expressed an interest in developing MIRVs. There remain the questions about what role the Prahar, BrahMos, and Irving missiles have, perhaps toward having nuclear roles. And the problem is the growing ambiguity about what India's intentions are add to this atmosphere of creating conditions that are ripe for adversary misperception. In Pakistan, it's moving from credible minimum deterrence to full spectrum deterrence, meaning having a tailored nuclear capability to asymmetrically respond to an Indian conventional threat at virtually most levels of Indian conventional escalation. However, it remains generally unclear, even to Pakistani analysts, how much conventional damage Pakistan will tolerate before it starts thinking about activating the nuclear threshold. Similar ambiguities are growing in China. It's merging its conventional and nuclear missile forces under a single command, while it's reorganizing its two previous India-facing military commands into functionally three. However, each of them has a more aggressive overall operational concept. There are also ongoing similar debates within China and within its influential PLA Academy of Military Sciences around revising or reinterpreting its no first use commitment, for example, to permit launch on warning. So that's an outline of really what the first half of the book is, and I'll now turn over to Yogesh, who will take you through India's doctrinal history and how it's reached this stage, as well as its nonproliferation policies and the policy recommendations that we propose for these issues.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks to the audience for coming along. Really appreciate that. Let me begin by thanking the Stimson Center, particularly Samir and his team, who's doing such a fabulous job on South Asian issues. And to organize this panel, thank you so much. We are also equally grateful to the panelists, Lieutenant General Nagal and Dr. Caroline Milne, to have joined us, and we look forward to their comments and suggestions. I will concentrate my bit of comments on the later half of the book, which kind of looks at how India is responding in terms of doctrinal responses to this changing strategic scenario in South Asia, but also look at what kind of policies is India following in the non-proliferation front, and finally the policy recommendations. So Henry Kissinger in his treatise, The Necessity of Choice, basically says that deterrence is a sum of three variables, which is power to project deterrence, the will to use it, and how do your adversaries actually look upon how they are perceived, how it is perceived by the adversaries. But the doctrine part covers the later two, the will to use nuclear weapons, and how your adversaries actually look upon and assess that will. So India's doctrine particularly caters to one thing: how should India employ its nuclear weapons in peace to strengthen deterrence? And if deterrence fails in war? There are two larger philosophical principles which underline India's nuclear doctrine. The first of that was the nuclear weapons an instrument of politics rather than an instrument of war fighting. It privileges deterrence over coercion or defense. The second issue, which looks at the philosophical underpinnings of deterrence thought in India, is the issue between credibility and risk when it comes to projecting deterrence, which was the whole debate between PMS Blackett and Albert Wohlstetter in 1960s, for that matter. And for deterrence to sustain for a long time, Indians look at not at the credibility of response, but the risk which any response poses in the minds of the adversaries. And for a certain time, minimal risk was sufficient for deterrence to operate. Those two philosophical principles laid down the barometer for two operational principles, which was the first was no first use, that you don't really need, because you don't think about them in terms of war fighting, you don't really need to use nuclear weapons first. But also a retaliation-only posture, which basically says that that neither for defense nor for coercion you can actually use nuclear weapons. How did India obtain these doctrinal principles? It was both, as we argue in our book, it was both a product of historical contingencies and evolution of India's nuclear thought during the Cold War. But also the 1999 and 2003, it was a pragmatic foreign policy choice as well. So if you look at the doctrine, it is much more of a statement of foreign policy rather than a military doctrine itself. So it's only that the military considerations start coming in after 2008, when India signs the Indo-US nuclear deal, and to a certain extent, that accommodation, that foreign policy objective has been met. How in the last decade or so, India's both India's will to use power and how it is assessed by its adversaries has come into question. Fundamentally, the problem is from Pakistan. That has been the singular source of doctrinal evolution. It has never believed in the NFU. The whole full spectrum deterrence challenges India's nuclear doctrine on NFU and massive retaliation. But India has not been able to resolve the instability paradox, that Pakistan continues to foment subconventional warfare under the shield of nuclear weapons. The second factor is the China and the growing conventional asymmetry. And there's this whole debate, which used to be a debate in 1960s, to use nuclear weapons to manage that asymmetry at conventional levels. And that debate has again resurfaced as the capabilities, the gap between China and India kind of increases. But lastly is the technological force development, which is driven largely because of India's arms spacing with China to kind of level that gap for deterrent stability, but allows greater options to Indian decision makers vis-a-vis Pakistan, or at least Pakistan perceives it to be the case. And lastly, the factor is that, as I said earlier, those foreign policy requirements of post-1998 are more or less now fully met with the Indo-US nuclear deal. So those considerations of restraint and a responsible nuclear power doesn't really figure in so much now. Now, that has led to specific complaints about NFU and massive retaliation. So, to give an example, NFU allows the adversary to take the initiative, restricts India's options. It hasn't helped the trust deficit with Pakistan, but also in a sense that the Indian decision makers are holding hostage the Indian populace, and which is very undemocratic. So the recommendation which has come from the strategic community is to make it more ambiguous, to give up NFU or make it much more ambiguous. On the other hand, the massive retaliation suffers from two major shortcomings. First is the issue of political will, that if push comes to shove, would Indian decision makers go the whole hog and carry out a massive retaliatory strike against Pakistan? And second is the issue of proportionality of force, that really you should only respond in proportionate measures. And therefore, the argument is that there is now a need to revise or bring back the flexibility, which was initially thought of in terms of when Vajpayee said in May 1998, adequate response, and the punitive response of 1999 draft nuclear doctrine. There are two fundamental problems with these suggestions, which we kind of outline in the book. The first is that any doctrinal reversion really doesn't address the fundamental problem India faces vis-a-vis Pakistan, which is the issue of instability paradox. That really doesn't address the issue of terrorism, the Pakistani support for it, and whether India can actually use the nuclear leverage to kind of stop that particular front from Pakistan. But also that if you revise your nuclear doctrine, you become much less credible in a sense, if you don't really have those capabilities to back up. So therefore, if massive retaliation is anyways less credible in Pakistani eyes, if you revise your doctrines, then it would be more so. And in China, particularly, there is no China-India nuclear scenario is one which suffers from deterrent stability but not crisis stability. So in a sense that India and China are two nuclear-armed neighbors who have never threatened each other with nuclear weapons, even when there is an active conventional front out there. So why would you risk, problems of nuclear crisis management on the India-China frontier when there's already so much of crisis stability, even if not different stability? On the non-proliferation front, we have three major arguments. So India for a long time was on the wrong end of the global non-proliferation regime. And the turnaround from 1998 has been exceptional in some sense. So for the NPT, India has moved from principled opposition to pragmatic support. This change in India's approach was driven by two factors, which was, the first one, it was a strategy for accommodation. But also, which historians have really not looked into, is that India had a deep interest in non-proliferation from the very beginning. So in fact, after the 1974 tests, PNE, India actually, at least privately, acquiesces to all nuclear control regimes, which the US and others wanted her to do without actually signing on to anyone. In fact, the first time India was asked to join the NSG was in 1976. But this was the diffidence of India, as well as this whole idea that this would be a back gate to the NPT, that India didn't really got onto that bandwagon. On the NSG, India's NSG, the whole process of NSG shows that even with the Indo-US nuclear deal, India's accommodation in the nuclear order is still not complete. And that nuclear politics dominates Indian foreign policy as much as it used to dominate during the Cold War, as well as post-1998. But it also tells you that there are limits to US influence, especially after the 2008 IAEA vote to 2018. You see this declining US influence in these regimes. On arms control, there are two major issues, the CTBT and FMCT. And we argue that India will continue to hedge until and unless there's a larger movement towards these treaties. But fundamentally, which people have not suggested so far and kind of overlooked, that military considerations will play an important role. In fact, in 1999, it was the Chief of Staff's committee which kind of, put a point to Vajpayee government that you really cannot sign the CTBT, when that movement was a little bit under the Indo-US nuclear dialogue between Jaswant Singh and Stroop Talbot was taking place. On the state-specific non-proliferation challenges, we kind of argue that India is generally supportive, but would not undermine its own interests. There would be issue linkages, and those issue linkages would be that how much US can deliver on the NSG, which you actually look back at the first vote in 2005 in IAEA when India voted against Iran. Those are the same issue linkages which will continue India's engagement on state-specific non-proliferation challenges. There are two larger recommendations we make. First is that to avoid these pitfalls of inadvertent and accidental escalation, there's a need for India, China, and Pakistan to talk, to underline their nuclear thresholds, to kind of clarify what they really mean in terms of their capabilities, and to find those paths to inadvertent and accidental escalation, but also devise CBMs which can arrest these paths. And second, which is more of an internal recommendation for India, is that India needs to kind of think about a public review of its nuclear doctrine, which hasn't come out since 2003, which was just another, in a sense that there's been 15 years since India hasn't clarified its position. And there's been a lot of technological force development, new strategic interactions, there are new challenges, new threats, there are new processes in place. And it would serve India's interest to come out with that document which would channel its nuclear energies. I'd stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Yogesh. And your last mention of CBMs and dialogue is it's music to the ears of all Stimson folks in this room, including our co-founder, Michael Crapon, who I think was one of the biggest proponents of this very early on in South Asia. General Nagal.
Thank you, Zabir. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. My being here, I can actually thank Michael. A few months ago, he asked me to give an interview for the South Asia Studies in Delhi. Travis and I played hide and seek for a long time. We couldn't meet. So then Samir was very kind, said, I told him that I'm coming to US to look up my son. So he said, if you're here, then we'll be your hosts. I'm very grateful to him for hosting me here. When I shifted from the strategic community to the think tank, one of my old instructors from the Indian Military Academy when I was a cadet was a person by the name of Gautam Sen. I think some of you may know him also. So he advised me, he says, when you shift, you must leave your uniform behind and you must look at the scholars, the analysts, the researchers in a different light. And what he told me stayed with me. He said, between the realm of ideas and public policy is this great community of analysts, researchers, theorists who will bridge the gap for you. And this, of course, stayed with me. And I've looked at this book precisely with that prism. And I've not tried to impose a practitioner's view on it or to find fault with whatever they've said. But before I start, I wish to clarify that the Indian nuclear doctrine, as enunciated in 2003, stands. And it was not a doctrine for a few years. It was a doctrine for a very long time. And why I say this is that you cannot read the 2003 press release in isolation. It must be read in conjunction with the draft which was released in 1999. And that is an enduring document. It talks of command and control, it talks of force structures, it talks of future ideas. So if you want to evaluate the doctrine, please focus on the draft and then you come down to discussing the nuts and bolts of it. Well, they've gone into many issues. They've contextualized the landscape for India, whether it's technical force development or doctrinal debates, posturing intentions, new generation of force projection, the naval domain is spoken of, the absence of strategic dialogue, and of course last, the non-proliferation issue. Whilst on the dialogue they've made some suggestions about the baby steps that can be taken and then where you go from first to the next to the last. But in the defense review, I think they've shied away, and I think they need to work a little more, because if they want to bridge this gap, then they must come out with some set of recommendations. So that is my first recommendation to them. But before I go into more detailed issues, I must say that when I read this book, and I've read it twice, because I found it very interesting. So I'll term it as a very useful document. It's an absorbing document, very readable for people from the lowest echelons to the highest echelons. It engages you in a discourse which keeps you attracted. It's informative because the amount of data they've got is extremely good. And finally, I would say it's a very interesting book to read. It's extremely well researched. And as a matter of fact, at times, you find it over-researched because they've quoted in every sentence. So one after the other, there's a machine gun fire saying this quote, this quote, this quote, which is very good. In that, what has happened, some quotes have come which may not be of that importance, so I think they can sift it later on. But the simplicity of the book is extremely attractive. It's an evergreen book because of the way they've laid it out, and the way they structured it, it can be updated at any point of time. I mean, that's the strength of this book, that every edition will bring out a new set of data, because they close the data somewhere around 15, 16. And after that, to my way of thinking, three very important documents have emerged. First, it has not emerged, it has continued, is the DoD report to the Congress about Chinese military power. 16, 17, 18 are very, very illuminating. Similarly, the Economic and Security Commission report is also very, very insightful. So I think these 3 years, China has made great strides. And day before yesterday's DIA release is an equally interesting one. And maybe what the President does today on the missile front, we'll see. So if this data was to be incorporated, the next edition would be very, very valuable. It has a very friendly layout. It is very relevant to what debates are going on. I would recommend that they also bring in the geostrategic issues which are ongoing, which generate these issues, because they require addressing as you are building your arguments. I agree with most of the issues which they've said, but there are disagreements, and that more because of my inside knowledge rather than as an analyst. So I won't go into my inside knowledge, but I will contest a few issues so that we can have a debate. Stop me when you wish to. First is the concept of credible minimum deterrence. It is not what the West describes, analyzes, talks of. The draft document very clearly laid it out. It is driven by 3 issues. First, what is the evolving strategic environment? Second, what are the technical imperatives which are going to emerge? Last, national security needs. So when the doctrine in the actual form was given to the stakeholders, it spelled out far greater details that were in the draft or in the ultimate. So don't measure it with your weighing scales. Take it as a separate entity, believe in what India says in the draft, and then evaluate it. So that's my next recommendation. Similarly, if you read one of these reports, I don't know which one, either DoD or the Economic Security Commission, they describe Chinese views, maximum, minimum, and somewhere in between, a moderated one. So I think you should look at the Chinese views also in those terms rather than in the Western terms. And therefore, we Indians look at it in those terms. And of course, we are yet to make sense of what FSD means. Jack is here, and we discussed this a few months ago. They keep saying it is tactical, operational, and strategic. So we still don't understand, because this lexicon is going on between us and them. We want to understand what do you mean by tactical level deterrence with nuclear weapons. If it is the old NATO Warsaw concept, very clear. But if you want to generate a new thing, then they need to come on this. So CMD gives us space, it gives us flexibility, and it also gives us scope for change. So it is not fixated, it is not fixed, it is dynamic. So India will continue to work on this, and what roadmap was laid down in 2003, 4, 5 still exists. It is being pursued. I'll come to some issues on India. We have no desire for war. So if we are looking at strategic deterrence, we are not looking at nuclear war fighting. So that's the basic concept India follows. And this perception may not be there on the other side, but it is our thought. Then they've said that technological imperatives are driving the Indian doctrine. No, sir. The DRDO may make some loose statements. And if you've noticed, post-2014, after some of us criticized this penchant for talking beyond the realm, they've shut up. And the Indian DRDO has been restructured also at the top level. So it's made an impact, and therefore you don't find. But let me assure you that if DRDO is researching anything, it is based on clearance by the political council. Because no money can be released to anybody for R&D without the political council's directions. So if they are going to state that they wish to develop a particular platform or a weapon system, then it is with clearance. At the moment, we have no dual use platforms. Whenever anything is inducted into the Strategic Forces Command, its testing becomes the prerogative of the SFC, and therefore it is announced. So we are not akin to China when it comes to dual use platforms. Since we don't have a bomber in the air fleet, our problem lies in dual use of aircraft, which is a fact which we accept. One more recommendation I have for the book is that when you examine doctrines and strategies, and when you're recommending some line of action, you may like to bring out the implications of your recommendations. That will add value to your book. I've already said that you can tell us what you want in the doctrinal review. The Indian bureaucratic system, I'm not talking about the bureaucracy, I'm talking about the military also, I'm talking about the political system also, is not generally inclined to review very often. We don't have a defense policy, we don't have a strategic policy, national security policy. So this was one of its type which came out, and I don't foresee a future review in the public domain, though internally the reviews do happen. Coming to Pakistan, I would recommend that you also examine the Pakistan strategy of brinkmanship in a little more detail to see how it reflects on India's requirements. You've spoken of the increase in fissile materials. The implications also can be looked at. FSD implications, I would definitely request you to examine in greater detail. Similarly, their conventional force modernization, which has happened post the major withdrawal of ISAF from Afghanistan. They've changed the structures of the mechanized forces in conventional terms also. Now, to China. There's a vast difference between what they profess and what they practice. And I can quote you n number of examples from the 2015 document or 2017 document on the Asia Pacific part, where they've said something: we oppose hegemony, they impose hegemony. We want a peaceful transition, they do force coercion. They talk of an international order and they propose an alternative. I mean, there are n number of examples. I will not go into details, but if somebody is keen, then I can send them to you. But post 2015 December, there have been major structural changes and transformation in the PLA. Okay, 1 minute, then I'll run through. So somebody needs to look at the directive Xi Jinping has given to the PLRAF after 2015 December. ASAT, the concept of active defense, how does it actually work on ground? BMD, the concept of local wars. The new missiles, the hypersonic missiles, the DF-26s and 16s. The SSF, cyber, space, electronic warfare, host of things have happened to destabilize. Inclusive threat is spoken of. A2AD, if it is West Pacific, it can turn to the Indian Ocean also. The PMS and the naval domain, they're using words like overseas interest, maintaining peace in the world. All these are part of their directives. This is Xi's directive to PLRAF. The non-acceptance of the ICJ ruling. And the wording at NFU is most troublesome. We have always pursued nuclear no first use policy, past tense. Next line, the unconditional part is to people who have no nuclear weapons or nuclear free zones. So to me it's very, very confusing. Last sentence, Xi Jinping states, PLRAF is core of strategic deterrence to China's power, cornerstone on which to build national security, irreplaceable role in containing war threats, to ensure favorable strategic posture for China, maintain global strategic balance and stability, precision strikes. I close.
Thank you, General Nagal. Caroline?
Well, I'm sort of regretting volunteering to go after General Nagal,
Oh my God.
as you have sort of answered some of my questions or superseded them. But hi, everyone. I'm Caroline Milne. I'm from the Institute for Defense Analyses, as Samir mentioned. And as he hinted, I am a outsider when it comes to South Asia issues. So thank you very much for having me here. I'm humbled to be part of this panel and part of contributing to this work. Being an outsider, especially coming after reading this book, I realized I'm happily an outsider because the issues here seem to me to be much more palpable and tangible than the world that I normally work in, which is sort of U.S. China, U.S. Russia, DoD, military services, operational issues. So I'm glad, as I said earlier, that you guys are tasked with solving this issue, and not me. But so with that being said, obviously take my comments with a grain of salt. So in terms of what I think the book does well, echoing General Nagal's comments, I would say the book provides a comprehensive, well-researched, well-documented unpacking of the technical facts. You come away from the book with a very clear view of what the security backdrop is in the region. And this, so as been said before, I believe this will be an essential reference for people studying South Asia going forward and in its updates. Particularly in this context, I think they do a wonderful job of blending, as Samir mentioned, the conventional and nuclear elements. I think a lot of times in this business, people tend to stovepipe in either one or the other, but to try to blend them is a tougher task, and they do it masterfully. Secondly, the other unique aspect of this book that I appreciated was the way they illuminated this regional trilateral perspective. As they mentioned, most of the current discourse or literature seems to be more bilaterally focused, India-Pakistan, India-China, but really trying to get at how these militaries interact in a three-way dynamic is critical. And how sort of that coupling aggregates into a larger dynamic is something that goes underappreciated. And also from a research standpoint, it's just a more difficult challenge to track how one state tries to deter two. In the US, or in my world, I think this mostly comes up when you're talking about how moves the US may take to deter North Korea will impact China. But it doesn't come up enough, in my opinion, and so I was really happy to see this trilateral view. And then finally, from sort of a signaling perspective, and your research of the signals that these countries are sending to one another, I'm frankly quite jealous of the evidence you've been able to amass to show both the signals that are sent or intended to be sent on one side and how they are then received, misreceived, misinterpreted on the other. So that was something I appreciated about the book. Now to sort of lay into the book, what would I have liked to see more? So I think I have three sort of broad points or broad areas of suggestions. And the first gets at this sort of core issue, which is India's potential interest in the concept of or capabilities befitting of nuclear warfighting. And so my sense of your core argument is that the emerging capabilities appear to be moving away from their historical emphasis on assured retaliation and more towards a warfighting capability. And the evidence, in addition to doctrinal debates, you cite certain force posture decisions. So emerging interests, short-range ballistic missiles, warheads potentially useful for tactical nuclear weapons, and also this sort of, the line I liked a lot was the feeling of fast-moving progress in the air, and that they're advancing on all technical aspects of their capabilities. And so I think there's a little bit of what I see as inferring doctrine, largely from force posture decisions going on here, and I think that can be a little risky at times because the evidence can be so cross-cutting. So the question is, how far does the evidence really suggest an interest in nuclear warfighting? And so there I think I was hoping for a little bit more of an appreciation of counter-arguments, which the general touched on a little bit, so now I'm not so sure how persuasive they are, but specifically internal pressure, the scientific establishment, the technical determinist argument, And sort of most importantly, I was curious, as I read the book, are these decisions more a product of prudent defense planning on behalf of India? In that they believe by developing these capabilities, they will ultimately deter Pakistani use, which will, in the long term, be stabilizing. Is that a possibility? And so, in a way, I see the India position as somewhat similar to the U.S. position in the most recent NPR vis-a-vis Russia, in that India feels like it has indications that Pakistan views or believes that nuclear empowerment will give them an advantage, and they are concerned that their existing capabilities do not provide an adequate counter to that confidence. And so investing in their perceived gap in options might be a way to solve this problem. As people have pointed out, it might not be. It might incite a sort of tit-for-tat dynamic, which would put you on an escalation ladder. So it's not clear that that will solve the eventual problem, but I at least think it potentially gives Indian military planners a bit more credit in that they might just be trying to do their job. In line with this sort of comment, I was curious that in identifying a doctrinal cause for these force posture developments, are we imposing a bit of a false choice? Although to be fair, you use a lot of verbiage like they're moving towards, not necessarily they're going for nuclear warfighting. So are we imposing a false choice between assured retaliation and warfighting? Because I see those two things as ends of a spectrum, and there's sort of a lot of room for maneuverability in between. And so sort of derivative questions of this, which gets to, I think, a little bit of what Samir was saying, is there such a thing as a perfect retaliatory posture from which any move away from indicates interest in nuclear warfighting? I don't think so. And this also gets back to the recommendations of the stability theorists in the late 50s, early 60s. You know, what they recommended for the U.S. and Soviet Union was very elegant and beautiful, but very hard to put into practice. And so, as the general mentioned, you know, secure second strike, assured retaliation, it's not a static entity. It's something that has to be maintained and updated over time. And so another derivative question of this is, and perhaps this is my sort of Western view or my Western lexicon and conceptual lens taking over, I couldn't quite understand why minimum deterrence and credibility need to be in tension with one another. It's my first set of comments. Second set of comments, and these are a little shorter, so hopefully we're good on time. My second set of comments focuses on the causal pathway to escalation, which I think you could draw out perhaps a little bit more clearly. So one of your essential findings seems to be that in the land and emerging naval domains, the nuclear threshold is increasingly blurred, and this is based on potential, one of the many factors this is based on is the increasing investment in dual use capabilities. Which I'm not so sure about now that I went after the general, but anyway, here I go. So I think you have definitely proven the whole, the dual use capability issue in terms of what they are deploying. However, how this exactly brings us to nuclear use in a situation, I wasn't as clear on. So I guess the question is really, I wanted to hear more about the exact scenario you were envisioning for nuclear use. And I know that these things are in almost an entire way impossible to anticipate, but I think I would have appreciated a bit more sort of drawing out how we get from dual use capabilities to nuclear use, because I think you might find as you impose more context on the problem, there are variables that come into play that may dampen incentives for escalation rather than increase. And so getting to my last set of comments, and this concerns sort of the world that I find myself increasingly in, actual strategy and actual policy making. So your two big recommendations are strategic dialogue and the India Strategic Defense Review. And I think in general and in short, I wanted to hear more on what exactly you want to see happen with those two things. So for dialogue, and for both of these, throughout the book, you set some high expectations for what we can get out of both of these things. And I was curious if we might be over or expecting too much from them. So another way of looking at this would be, I was curious, and maybe this is my just ignorance on regional dynamics, but I was hoping to hear more about what the history of dialogue has been and why it might be more successful today than in the past. And perhaps that's obvious to experts in this region. Or also, or another way would be to sort of, what are the first types of things the states should be talking about? Let's sort of maybe start with low-hanging fruit and move on to more difficult topics. But sort of taking a crawl, walk, run approach to dialogue. Sort of what are the different bins of steps? And then in terms of the official public defense review, I would echo the general's comments here in that, and we talked a little bit about this before we got up here, the defense review, as you go through the book, you set some high expectations for it as well, but I was curious about how you would actually pull off a defense review. As you mentioned, the first ever, I believe, would have been by the NSC in 1998, but it was preempted by the test. So today, in 2018, who's the best entity to lead this process? Would it be the NSC? And how would the services approach this issue? What would the interagency or inter-service process look like? And how would the lack of strategic planning that you mentioned impact the exercise? So sort of general process-oriented questions, which I think you're in a really good position to get at more, which would be something I think that policymakers might resonate much more with policymakers who are more interested in sort of solutions and what's the best solution for their problem today. So with that, I'll close, and I hope some of that was useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And I think both General Nagal and Dr. Milne have offered a wealth of feedback that might be useful for the next 3 books that you guys work on. But take that into consideration for right now. Let's not just not respond to it. We'll open up to some Q&A, but I want to pick up first on something that Yogesh, you mentioned, because I think it actually opens up a set of questions that everyone can engage on here. So you made a point that there is no doctrinal revision that really addresses this stability and stability paradox for India, or it has either not been contemplated or has not happened. And so I guess when I heard that, I was starting to wonder, is it because we're just in the wrong domain? Are these strategic tools of advanced either strategic weapons or advanced conventional weaponry really the right tools to address the particular political objectives of the instability side of the stability and stability paradox? There's a really interesting article about 8 months ago by Michael Kaufman, who writes a lot on U.S.-Russia dynamics. And so I think this is relevant not just for sort of the India-Pakistan context, but a lot of other dyads, where he talks about Russian strategy, which is, the United States is described as fairly aggressive and offensive, is really a strategy of raiding and brigandery, which I think is the title is fantastic, but he sort of goes into detailing this. And a lot of this it is a strategy, and yet it seems to have low consequence for sort of the higher level concerns. So I guess when I'm hearing that, and you're saying that there's not been a doctrinal sort of response to this, is it just because these aren't particularly good tools for what are low level probes, disruption, raids, or even sort of efforts to sort of project influence, or are those challenges just not of a high enough consequence to warrant the kind of doctrinal revision? So maybe that's sort of a broad question. It's not just for the India-Pakistan domain, but also for maybe the U.S.-Russia context or other dyads as well. But maybe you can offer some thoughts on that.
Should I?
Sure.
Okay. Thanks, Amir. Yeah. Look at this. The whole issue basically comes down to one thing. Whether the Indian decision makers, which is the political class, it's very different, highly risk averse for that matter. Whether Indian political decision makers could think about a terrorist strike that would lead to conventional escalation and then to nuclear escalation, what would it be worth to have your populace at risk? That is the dynamics which the political decision makers have to make. And I don't think that kind of a decision would be taken in a democratic polity like India. So, the inherent risk averseness is extremely, important to kind of think about some of these things. But they are also not good tools. If you actually look at the last 20 years, and India has been battling about this for last 20 years. The world has been battling about this since, we thought about stability and stability paradox in the 60s. And whether we have come to a right conclusion, I don't think so. But also there are not so much of high consequence as well. How much of, whether you would invest your strategic, security on a terrorist strike, I don't think that would happen. So there are all of those, but fundamentally it's about risk averseness.
Anyone else want to comment on that? General Naval?
Well, the first thing on the paradox is that the Indian doctrine does not look at the paradox at all. It's very clearly stated it is for WMD. I mean, if you look at WMD, it is nuclear, biological, and chemical. So we've never looked at the nuclear doctrine solving the paradox. I take your mind back to the Afghan war. When the Soviet Union invaded and the Mujahideen came in from the other side, Russia faced a similar, Soviet Union faced a similar dilemma. How much to expand, how much not to expand into Pakistan, they did not. So, if there is a certain amount of instability at the subconventional level, which India can manage, there's no need to raise the level beyond that. So, we don't want to link it at all. And this, I would say, a policy trap. If you decide to get into this policy trap, you may land up taking wrong decisions. Whether we are risk averse or not, that is based on the policy of the time. Like if you look at China's 24 characters, you can apply it to India today. There is no need for India to get into a conflict mode or war management. The causes for India to go to war have to be so substantial that it is prepared to risk its future. If a smaller country wants to do it, then it is their problem. I mean, I don't want to use this term, but since this point has come up, we've got a scholar called Bharat Karnad. Whenever he talks of Pakistan, he talks of linearity and he talks of destruction. So he says it's not a good thing to do, but the fact is that we are not looking at nuclear solutions to conventional or subconventional means. So we'll keep out of this as far as India is concerned. And we have many other means to look at. I was talking to the faculty yesterday. The biggest tool with us is on the economic front. It's on the water front. I mean, there are so many other issues which we can look at. So we'll not, I personally don't agree to this paradox.
So is the question, are nuclear weapons the right tools to be addressing the paradox with?
Or advanced conventional weaponry, right?
Okay.
So,
Okay.
precision targeting.
I guess my response to that is that, at least from my sort of the place where I sit now, maybe not, but our response is driven by our perception of what we believe the adversary believes about this instability-stability paradox. So I think that if you see a belief on the other side that that paradox exists, or that strategic capabilities do open up the door for conflict at lower levels, then we need to take steps to create options that will disavow the adversary of that perception. So I do think it's a lot about what you see the other side, investigate, and what signal you can send about their ability to maneuver.
Yeah, I can just jump in and I'll bundle together a couple of things. So just building on these points, if we don't mention it in the book, we've mentioned it previously that, and as General Nagal has said, India has no desire to attack Pakistan, and the only reasonable, feasible pathway that they see is in response to a major Pakistani terrorist attack. And so following from that, India should not be thinking about, what new nuclear capabilities do we need, what perhaps new prompt conventional strike options do we need, but where the actual problem is in the initial intelligence and in the initial policing to stop that attack happening. Indian police services today are very understaffed across the country. We know the way the Mumbai attack started, in which a local fisherman noticed these two fast-moving boats with heavily armed people jumping aboard, running into the city. He reported it to the police, and the policeman said, it's probably nothing. So it's kind of, we're jumping too many steps ahead to start thinking about these kinds of operations and what should India do in nuclear terms, when the effort, I think, should be toward what they should do toward that end of it, which is both more cost-effective and which will ultimately solve the problem at a much lower level. And this kind of brings me back to this alludes also to the comments about what we would recommend for the Indian Public Defense Review. And I mean, perhaps you judge us to be still not going far enough, but we made the point that the principle should be, there should be a clear disaggregation of specifically and isolated nuclear threats to which a nuclear response is there for, and everything else must be conventional, ranging from policing up until conventional operations, rather than what we see in a lot of the conversations about ambiguity. You might say that we could have gone further and started, planning out very specific scenarios and so on, but we thought that by outlining that as a very broad principle, that would be a great place to start.
All right, fantastic. So I've been a very poor time manager today, and we have at max 20 minutes for what I imagine will be a number of questions. So I will try to take as many as possible, and at some point we have to bundle them and just open up to the panel to respond to pieces as need be. So please raise your question in the form of a question, and we'll start with this one right here. Can you wait for the microphone? Sorry. And introduce yourself, too.
I'm Heather Wiest. I'm a researcher for the Partnership for Global Security. I've been hearing a lot of suggestions that maybe nuclear weapons or even tactical nuclear weapons are an option as a response to terrorism. And my understanding of a terrorist act is that it's a sub-state actor who is attempting to initiate change in a political way by hurting civilians, and so trying to influence political leverage using civilians. But as a response, if, for example, there was a Pakistani terrorist attack on India, if India was to use a nuclear response, it seems like nuclear weapons are a more political tool, like maybe if Pakistan's government attacked the Indian government, then that would make sense. But how would it make sense to attack, to basically try to punish Pakistan in that way when it was in response to a sub-state group, which the government does not have control over their action?
Great. General Longa, do you want to try that?
I don't think that's an option. I mean, not because it is not doable, but that is not a very rational action. There are other responses. I think France is the only country which may have, in 2006, said once that we will hold the sponsoring state responsible. I think it was referring to Iran at that point of time. Our nuclear doctrine is very categorical. It only talks of nuclear retaliation after being struck on India or forces anywhere, or big chemical or biological attacks. So there is no talk, there is no alluding to, there is no reference to terror being addressed by nuclear weapons. And it is totally against the tenets of deterrence, if I can use. Sure.
Hi, my name is Aranjana. I'm a PhD student in Georgetown studying theology and nuclear disarmament. I actually met Dr. Joshi a few years ago. I don't know if you remember me in a similar event like this. It's delightful to see you again. My question is regarding what you said, which was very insightful regarding India's role in nonproliferation and the fact that historians have not studied it sufficiently. And if I'm not wrong, India was also very active in ENDC, the 18-Nation Disarmament Commission, and that's a part of history that has not been studied very well. And related to my research interests, I would be very interested in knowing if you found any religious discourses, since I study religion and theology, any religious discourses in any of these 3 countries that you've studied, which are used to either substantiate or refute its disarmament policy or its deterrence policy.
Interesting. Yogesh, you want to try to take that first?
Yeah, thanks, and good to see you. Yeah, I would say that as an actor in the non-proliferation debate, there has been a lot of focus on India, but not in terms of why and what India did at various stages of its history, especially with primary documentation. And my whole problem with the way Indian nuclear history has been written is through the foreign archives. So what the Indians are telling the Americans is not what they are thinking internally. Those are 2 very, very different things. And therefore, there's a lot of scope to look at India's nuclear history again in a fresh perspective, especially with the opening of the Indian archives. I haven't seen in my own research any archival evidence where any religious text is invoked from the Indian side. I haven't seen that. But the calculation has always been very profound, especially when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons. And I would just quote one of the things which we quote, one document which was basically written by Raja Ramanna P. N. Huxer and Vikram Sarabhai in 1970. And there was this whole debate in Indian Parliament after China sent a satellite into orbit in April 1970 that you should have tactical nukes for conventional operations on the Himalayan frontier. And the document says, as soon as one side goes tactical, it's gonna go strategic. So there is, and that particular phrase can sum up Indian nuclear thinking for a long time. In fact, even today, if you go by the doctrine. And there is where that thinking is coming from. It's very practical, but it's also the way Indian strategic thought looked at the Cold War. And that hasn't been really encapsulated and touched upon in the strategic discourse so far. Where is the evolution? Why do you have a doctrine in 1999 in the way it did? And where are the causes and where are the motivations of that coming from? And that is coming from this historical evolution, which gets institutionalized in the MEA, in the military, for that matter. So the whole doctrine is basically the sum of the speeches which Vajpayee gives from May 1998 till December 1998. So I think there is a historical context to what India's nuclear thinking has been, and it has been under research. And it is for very practical considerations about nuclear weapons, not as such the religious text. I don't know so much about Pakistan and China. I don't believe China there would be a lot of religious texts, but Pakistan maybe. Yeah, right?
Yeah, I would just build on what Yogesh was saying, in that I myself find it hard to see a direct connection to a specifically religious text of whatever religion. But there is a strong streak of morality that has run through India's way of speaking about nuclear weapons. So you'll see Indian officials describing the NPT as immoral because it legitimizes for all time 5 states as holding these horribly destructive weapons. You will see, for example, even before 1998, nuclear thinkers of the time, such as K. Shandarji, K. Subramaniam, talking about minimum deterrence and saying that not only is it more cost-effective in terms of we only need a few weapons to deter, but that the alternate approach, as represented by the U.S. and USSR, who incidentally they've developed this great phrase, they'll call them nuclear theologians, in terms of their view of this very abstract Herman Camm level of thinking about things. They will say that the U.S. and USSR approach of having tens of thousands of nuclear missiles, enough to destroy them many times over, is not just cost ineffective, but it's immoral. And the Indian approach will be moral in having the minimum necessary to deter. So those are just a couple of examples. And I think the deeper question is when Sundarji and Subramaniam are having these debates, we've only read about what they've written or spoken about. Is the morality focus part of those initial debates? Or is it something that they bring in later on as an additional, powerful, just rational justification for what they're doing? Is the morality thing really rhetorical, or is it something that really conditions nuclear force thinking at the operational level? Perhaps it's something that General Nagal could comment on as well.
In the Indian context, whatever my discourse and interaction with the Foreign Service has been, it is more the Gandhian thought which pervaded in their thought processes. So, not in the context of non-violence, but in the context of morality and acceptance of what is right and what is wrong. So there was no religious discourse. In any case, if there was one, there would have been a hue and cry in the parliament next morning. Whereas in the 80s, I may be dated wrongly or may get the name wrong, I think there was a book written by one Breda Malik in Pakistan who spoke of the chronic concept of war, where terror is to be used as a tool. But it is in the conventional context and not in the nuclear context. And that got a lot of publicity in General Zia's time, because at that time they were fighting in Afghanistan and they were developing the concept of trying to impose a war on infidels. And therefore, maybe, I'm not saying I have any proof to say so, that thought could have gone to the nuclear domain to say that use terror as a tool. But it was initially written for the conventional context. On the Chinese side, I have found nothing.
So I think this question relates to what I see, and I think you've already described your next book in both of your comments. I think this gets at sort of the third sentence in your introduction, where you talk about how nuclear policy has long been viewed at home domestically as an essential expression of Indian identity. So I was really captivated by that statement, and you touch on it throughout the book, the responsibility issue, argument, question of morality. Perhaps there's a religious element to it, but I think your study or your research program is terrifically postured to get at what is the Indian nuclear identity, what are the sources of that, and what are the consequences of that. And particularly, I found it interesting in the sort of tension between their nuclear weapons policy and their nonproliferation policies. How does it manifest in those dimensions as well?
Fantastic. Well, 1 second. So we're going to take 3 more questions because we're running out of time, and then we will have the panelists all get an opportunity to address whatever questions we can field. So we'll start with Michael.
Yogesh, Frank, congratulations on the book. My question to all of you is whether you think India will proceed with MIRVing, putting more than one warhead on some of its missiles. Not whether it should or shouldn't, but whether you think it's likely to happen.
Great. Very succinct. Okay. One more back there. So the gentleman in the blue first, so I'm going to...
Hello, I'm Chaz Jones. I'm an MA candidate at American University studying U.S. foreign policy and national security. So apologize I haven't read the book. It seems like a really great read. I'll have to check it out. But I just have a quick question. With your research and the book writing process, did you come across anything about how imperative nuclear security will be, particularly in this region? For instance, regarding Pakistan and how that's going to impact the grave threat of proliferation there and that particular region that the book covers, because I think there's honestly kind of a crossover between nuclear security and also the grave threat of a non-state actor, potentially nuclear terrorism, just because Pakistan for years has kind of struggled with proper command and control, proper nuclear security procedures, and the Bush and the Obama administration both gave billions of dollars to try and improve that, but they still struggle with it. So I guess that's my question, is like anything about nuclear security you came over and like how that will be, I guess, addressed in years to come.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
That's a great question, and it's really relevant because I remember very early on in your book you talk about the potential for like growth in weapons-grade plutonium should this fast breeder reactor actually come online. I think the numbers look to me like it could increase the amount of weapons-grade plutonium by 25% each year or something like that, which is stunning. So Anupam, no. Okay, we'll save the complication for later. Third question over there, sir. It's you.
Hi, I'm Joseph Newman. I'm also an MA candidate at American University. My question, since one of your recommendations was strategic dialogue, and I believe it was kind of brought up earlier, is it possible to have strategic dialogue without exactly calling it that? You mentioned that each of these forces, they have kind of a robust history of crisis with one another and interactions, and then given this whole, economic and anti-terrorism new cooperation that they've taken on in the international realm, especially with like the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, do you think it's possible to kind of just, with their forced familiarity, just, instead of blurring the lines of incidental or accidental escalation, but rather creating a more, I guess you would say, kind of robust crisis management system just by these actors interacting through these international organizations?
Great. Wouldn't that be wild if this triangular competition gets sorted out within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? That'd be fun. Okay, so we have 3 questions on MIRVing, nuclear security, and strategic dialogue. Should we just start down the line? And
Yeah.
start with Frank?
So do you want me to answer 3? Or?
Take whatever pieces you want, but
Okay.
try to keep it to a minute each, and we'll close it off.
Okay. So MIRVing, I think yes. DRDO has expressed interest in this position. There's a lot of Indian debate about what they think China sees as being credible, and that MIRVing warheads is essential toward that. So short answer is yes, that's my opinion. On nuclear security, we talk about this, we spend a lot of time talking about the Pakistan Nasser tactical nuclear weapons and the dangers of those being forward deployed and what's called the use it or lose it scenario. If they come within range of advancing enemy forces, they could be captured by enemy forces. They could be used due to the field commander thinking that they have to use them. With regard to nuclear material security, this is something we could have talked about a bit more. Both are developing, their fissile material stockpiles. But one article that I would point you to for more on this was one that was written, I think about a year ago now, by Christopher Clary and Ankit Panda. I forget the title of it, but it's focused upon Pakistan's nuclear weapons developments and the security, I think particularly on the SSBN component, the nuclear security things that would come out of that. Finally, on the potential strategic dialogue, I think it's absolutely possible, and perhaps in the way it's phrased in the book, we maybe make it look like it's going to be a lot more public and a lot more fanfare starting than it can be. It could simply involve quiet back-channel conversations among the national security establishment of all 3 states that we don't actually come to learn of publicly. And it can start in the form of simple conversations. That's the way it can start, and then we can have, as trust or just mutual understanding, and hopefully build toward a more formalized process and toward deliverables. But it's very easy, and all states are very used to having these very quiet conversations that never come to public light.
Yep. Thanks, Michael. I think the answer is yes, and it's not just the interest of the DRDO. If you look at, MRVs and MIRVs, so the MRVs would basically increase. One of the fundamental problems with the Indian force structures right now is the whole fission-fusion debate. So how much bang for the buck do you really have? And there is a lot of issue in terms of reliability. So MRVs kind of solve that problem, that if you have a 20 kiloton device vis-a-vis 300 kiloton device from against China, then MRVs kind of resolve that. I think from Agni 4 onwards, you have a 3-bus warhead. But MIRVs, on the other hand, would help you for survivability issues as well. So I think, yes, there is a huge interest in there. So I think they from Agni 4 onwards, I guess MRVs would be the thing. And with the sixth submarine, which would be the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Range submarine, there would be MRVs in that as well on the sea domain. Yeah, the imperatives of nuclear security, I think that's a very valid question. And if you see during the nuclear security summits, India was a major partner. India also committed certain funds to the IAEA. You have a global center for non-proliferation now in somewhere near Delhi. So yeah, but it also depends upon, global diplomacy in a sense. India would bandwagon if there is a particular agenda to bandwagon, and then if it goes out of the limelight in the US, it would happen everywhere. It would happen the same everywhere, and you see that with the nuclear security summits again. Under the Obama administration, that was the main plank. With Trump, no. So states also respond to that, I guess. I would just second the comments of Frank on the strategic dialogue thing, and there have been back channels right from 1960s. So the first time India opened up to China after the 1962 war was this back channel between one of the trusted advisors of Indira Gandhi and the Chinese in 1969. So yeah, the back channels, and especially things which are not in the limelight, go way forward in carrying these dialogues to a point where they can really hit off. Even the Musharraf-Manmohan Singh dialogue in early 2000s was another example of those.
So General Naval and Dr. Milne, if you want to address any of the questions or final closing comments.
I'll address two issues. Nuclear security. That's been India's concern, and of late Pakistan has also been very active on that front. As a matter of fact, they've raised a special force under the SPD to look after the security of their systems. We also participated in an old Soviet Union when it disintegrated. There were lots and lots where Americans also went. Even our scientists went and helped. So we had picked up some important information and systems and knowledge of what is done. And we've incorporated that in the 90s in what we were doing. And of course, our procedures and systems are very, very strict, if I can use those words. On the dialogue, nothing is impossible. As a matter of fact, between India and Pakistan, 2-3 small steps have already been taken, and they were taken 2 decades ago. We share our nuclear installation data on the 1st of January every year, where every year they are not to be attacked. When we do our ballistic missile launches, we inform each other. So it's not that there is absence of dialogue, but yes, the progress has not been substantial. So especially with the Chinese, I think they need to accept India as a power with adequate nuclear capability. When they dialogue if you read the 2017 white paper on the Asia Pacific, they're talking of a Southeast Asia which is nuclear free, but they only said 5 nuclear powers will decide this. So India is kept out of the loop. Pakistan, of course, is not spoken of at all. So China needs to change its attitude before a serious dialogue can take place. On the conventional mode, they do it very regularly. But on the nuclear mode, they've not been so forthcoming. But I hope it'll happen.
My response will be very short.
Get the last word.
In response to Michael, I agree. I think the answer is yes, primarily because it seems that all levels of indicators are pointing in that direction: strategic, domestic, political, and technological. And then on the dialogue point, not so much, I'm not getting at the potential for dialogue, but you mentioned the potential ability of dialogue to address the issue of blurred lines, and I would just raise that it's possible that dialogue might not clear up those lines, and purposefully so. And that may or may not be a good or bad thing for stability, depending on how both sides perceive the stability-instability paradox, to bring us full circle.
Fantastic. So thank you all for joining us. I apologize to wrap up pretty quickly. The book is available for purchase outside. Please grab a copy and continue the conversation. Thank you to the speakers for joining us today.
Thank you.
And for all of you here and online for participating. And I'll just ask that we have to clear the room for another event that's coming after. We're moving on to another domain of nuclear security. So please take your conversations outside, and we can continue from there. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, General. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your comments. Yeah.
Good job finding me on time.